82nd Avenue, Portland, Oregon. It's called the Avenue of Roses, and yet, if you walk down it, the closest thing you'll find to a rose is the dying grass and weeds sticking up out of the sidewalks. 82nd is Portland's premier east side highway, and yet, perhaps remarkably and perhaps not, it lacks any real character or charm. Seriously, even one playing the devil's advocate would have a hard time speaking its praises. Limited appealing architecture at its sides, narrow sidewalks, and even more narrow lanes of traffic. An editorial from back in 1976 described 82nd Avenue as follows: "Motorists do not drive 82nd Avenue in search of an aesthetic experience. They drive 82nd Avenue to get somewhere or to find something." That description is still fairly accurate today. Nobody hangs out here just to be here and feel the vibes. They're here because they need to be, for whatever reason. Otherwise, they'd probably prefer to be somewhere else. But this beat-up highway, with plans to revive it over the next few years, was not always like this. In this film, I seek not to do a general history of a roadway, but rather to take a look at how said roadway has transformed over time, and in doing so has helped to transform the communities that immediately surround it. This is the story of how a simple farm road became one of the most traveled routes in one of America's largest cities. I've spent a lot of time on and around 82nd, being an East Side kid. I've worked just off it for almost 20 years. I know it as well as the very streets I've lived on throughout my life. And it's always been the same, at least as far as I can tell. I recently dug up some video I shot driving around with my friend back in 2004, and seriously, it looks the same. I was able to briefly spot a few long-gone sites, such as a Circuit City I used to go to and the organ grinder when it was still in business. 82nd has been an Oregon State highway for nearly a century, functioning as the northern portion of Highway 213, or the Cascade Highway, which technically travels all the way down to Salem. It's also been rough around the edges for a long time, while not necessarily being a place where you're guaranteed to be visited with danger. It's one of those stretches where you can walk it 100 times and be just fine, and then on the 101st day, get accosted by 5 different people. Danger periodically feels imminent, and yet it often doesn't materialize, at least in my experience. It is also one of Portland's most dangerous routes to drive on. In 2022, the intersection of 82nd and Gleason was deemed the city's most dangerous for pedestrians. Along with this one, 82nd's intersections with Powell, Sandy, and Foster all ranked among Portland's 30 most dangerous intersections. As a whole, 82nd Avenue ranked 11th among roadways for traffic deaths, 7th for bicycle accidents, 5th for car accidents, and 3rd for pedestrian accidents. 82nd has been noted for its narrowness, congestion, and questionable crosswalks. Oh, and it just happens to be the avenue that I got mugged along back in 2017. It's been neglected for quite some time, which is almost metaphorical, as it's the street you cross to venture into what is today the furthest east side of Portland, the part of town that's so often forgotten, the part of Portland you never saw pop up on an episode of Portlandia. On average, poverty is greater out here than in other parts of town. People tend to be more burdened by the cost of housing, as well as other necessities, and it's also the part of town with the highest population of people of color. 82nd, between Powell Boulevard and Division Street, cuts right through what is known as the Jade District, a major Asian commercial hub. But the large Asian population that lives out here stretches far beyond that district alone. Today, Portland stretches out as far as 185th Drive to its far northeast end, but for a long time, 82nd Avenue was more or less considered the city's eastern border, something that definitely had an effect on its change over these many years. When its origins are referenced, many just say that 82nd Avenue started sometime in the early 1900s, at a time when Portland's east border was still far west of there. And thus, nobody thought of it as a future highway while it was functioning as little more than a mostly dirt road, primarily used by local farmers to transport their goods to the market. It's important to realize that much of the land that is now Portland's east side was mainly farmland before commercial and residential developments eventually overtook it. Way out 82nd Way, it was farmland and little else. But this road, as I found, actually dates back a ways before the early 1900s. This is an 1891 diagram outlining the Mount Tabor area, existing just west of 82nd. The information included with this image on Vintage Portland noted the far east end aligned with 82nd Avenue. I was able to use a distinct intersection that remains practically the same today, that being the intersection of Stark and Thorburn near 74th Avenue, and count the blocks off to verify the road to the east end of this diagram does, in fact, align with 82nd Avenue. This diagram marks that in 1891, this route was known as Anderson Street. I was able to find a few articles about this street, including one from 1914 referencing Anderson in the Lentz neighborhood, which 82nd goes through today. While doing a newspaper search, I found no articles about 82nd predating 1915. This leads me to believe that around the 1914-1915 time, Anderson was renamed 82nd Avenue. Whenever the change actually happened, it had to have happened as the two routes were in the exact same spot. While the early 1930s are regarded as the time in which 82nd was first paved, this is only partially true. Back in 1918, construction money was budgeted to pave 82nd from Section Line Road, Division Street today, down to Foster Road. It makes sense that this portion would be paved first, as much of the avenue's commerce was through here, and when discussing pleasant drives in the Portland area, taking Powell Valley Road, or Powell Boulevard today, to 82nd and then going up to Section Line Road, Division, was often included amongst the most peaceful and serene routes to travel. With regards to the rest of 82nd, at least within the city of Portland, the strong motivation to pave it was twofold. It had established itself as the eastern edge of the city, and in 1932, it was officially made a state highway. Up until 1890, Portland was mostly just the downtown area, but in 1891, it annexed the towns of Albina and East Portland, gaining the city land as far east as 16th Avenue. This was followed by the annexing of Sellwood in 1893. Between 1905 and 1915, Numerous other stretches of land, including St. John's and Linton, were annexed to the city. Over time, Portland just continued expanding east, which is interesting as once the city's east end reached the area around 82nd, it stopped expanding for a long time. Most of the land it annexed east of there was not added to the city until the 1980s. In fact, for a long time, this area had tried to establish itself as its own town, located between Portland and Gresham. But even by the time of this picture, depicting the vicinity of 82nd and Halsey in 1916, we can see much of the surrounding area is fairly vacant, with greater development in the distance. And even by the early 1930s, while there were commercial structures at busy intersections, much of 82nd was peppered with small, single-family dwellings. As the city continued to expand eastward, making the eventual Avenue of Roses of greater prominence than a simple farming road, it was inevitable that it would expand. The idea for expanding this avenue dated back into the 1920s, with the wheels of expansion driving forward once it became a highway. The main work started in early 1934 when a $68,000 portion of the project of expanding and paving 82nd Avenue went into effect. This covered the paving of the avenue from Halsey Street to Sandy Boulevard, a distance of just over 1.2 miles. Later on, in November 1934, the next stage of construction was set with the planned paving of 82nd between Halsey and Clinton Street, just south of Division. When this was completed, the next section was announced in April 1935 with the paving of 82nd between Foster Road and Flavelle Street. With 82nd running beyond Sandy Boulevard, ending at what is today a combination of Lombard and Killingsworth Streets, but back in the day was strictly Killingsworth Street, I'm not certain exactly when this stretch was paved, but a photograph taken in 1934 showing 82nd north of Sandy shows it as still a thin road only paved for a few blocks, with the road still dirt beyond there. This picture suggests this portion was probably paved later in the project and perhaps was not as wide initially as the rest of 82nd, as it was only about 7/10 of a mile to its end at Killingsworth. It also made sense that the paving project's most southern point was Flavelle Street, as this was the southern edge of Portland in that vicinity at that time. I also was unable to find any references to paving the stretch between Clinton Street and Foster Road, but as 82nd continued on south out of Portland and into Clackamas County, a few years after this paving project was done, the Portland Chamber of Commerce began putting the pressure on them to continue this paving project as the avenue went along. I can just see it, the fresh, clean new highway hitting Flavelle, and suddenly one is left on a rutted, unimproved stretch for who knows how long. I can understand putting the pressure on. I gotta say, what first drew my attention to the history of 82nd was discovering the numerous pictures taken of it back in the 1930s, showing it looking drastically different than it does now. Seeing how thin the road looked in many of these pictures, I initially figured it was paved but remained a simple 2-lane road and didn't expand to 4 lanes until work was done on it in the 1950s. But then I saw this overhead view of 82nd and Division from 1948, and noticed it was 4 lanes wide at that time. I then took a look at some pictures of 82nd post-1934, in particular from around 1937, and it's clear in some of these that even by then the avenue was 4 lanes wide. Those 34 pictures just tried to pull a fast one on me. Transformed into a major highway and the Portland area's most prominent east side roadway running north and south, it was inevitable that commercialism would follow. I mean, look at it now. In fact, before the 30s were even over, the city of Portland was making moves when they rezoned 82nd to be used for strictly commercial and industrial purposes, which would mark the beginning of the end for future residences along the avenue. I noticed that many of the houses still standing, which have almost all been converted into businesses, along 82nd were built pre-1930, and little by little, commerce came. In particular, sparked by the boom in America's auto industry in post-World War II America. Lots of car lots began popping up along 82nd, something that hasn't really changed all that much. That being said, a good number of the businesses that existed back then along the avenue were mostly small local businesses catering to the needs of the people within its vicinity, more or less the east side of town. But even this wouldn't last forever as the business culture began to shift going into the 1960s. An early drive behind that was the opening of the original Eastport Plaza Mall, which opened in 1960, the same year as the massive in its time Lloyd Center opened closer to the city's central hub. But even this mall almost never happened, at least not where it ended up. Back in 1950, this same land at 82nd and Holgate was set to become the new stadium for Portland's minor league baseball team, the Beavers. Unfortunately, something else happened in this same year, the start of the Korean War. In relation to this, on September 8, 1950, the United States enacted the Defense Production Act of 1950, which led to the restrictions and strict priorities when it came to the use of available materials, such as wood and steel. This caused an immediate halt on the planned construction of this stadium, as construction on places of amusement were being forcibly canceled. When this restriction was lifted, costs had increased steadily, and the team found they could no longer afford to build a new stadium. Eventually, they would relocate to Multnomah Stadium, the stadium that is today Providence Park. By the time Eastport Plaza came into being, 82nd had gone through another phase of reconstruction. It started at the end of 1953 when the Oregon State Highway Commission approved work on 82nd, stretching all the way down to Oregon City. Articles note that it was going to expand to 4 lanes as far south as King Road in Clackamas County, implying 82nd was still, by the 50s, a thinner route once it left the Portland city limits. If anything, the key change that occurred during the 50s was the creation of a center/turn lane that runs nearly the whole length of the avenue as it exists today. This alteration thus widened 82nd from 4 lanes, 2 going north, 2 going south, to 5. And if you look back at that overhead view of 82nd and Division in 1948, you'll note even then the fact that 82nd was a rather narrow highway. Adding a middle lane was not going to help this, and even today that is one of 82nd Avenue's trademarks, how narrow it is. And this stretches to the sidewalks that line each side of the road as well. The only real exceptions to this are the portions of 82nd that had enough space on each side to have the sidewalks built a short distance away from it, as well as areas that have been drastically changed since construction work in the 1950s, such as present-day Eastport Plaza. While it was more commonplace in the past to make roads narrow, and it happened with all sorts of highways, I wonder how much of an effect pre-existing structures had on the widening of 82nd over the years, in particular the residences that stood alongside it. Only a few years before the first widening of 82nd during the 1930s, Burnside Street in Portland was widened on both the east and west sides of the Willamette River. In that case, they had no choice but to alter the buildings that stood along Burnside. On the east side, they converted the fronts of the building's first floors to arcades, allowing sidewalks to travel through there. And on the west side, well, they just hacked the front ends off of the buildings. Such is why so many buildings in this area are thin in appearance today. In 82nd's case, it seems they may have had just enough space to cram this all in, but with not really any room left to breathe. I see possible evidence of this in particular along 82nd between Fremont and Humboldt Streets, the one stretch along the avenue that's still primarily residential. But if you look at these homes today, they all have these extremely thin front yards, as though they may have been larger once upon a time when the avenue was a little thinner. In several images of 82nd before the completion of its widening in the 1930s, the homes along it are a good distance back from it, with more normal appearing front yards. And then, in the immediate aftermath of the widening, we have examples such as this 1934 picture taken between Eugene and Thompson Streets, and all the homes barely have a front yard at all. Maybe pre-existing buildings like these homes had an effect, and I don't know, maybe I'm just off my rocker. But while on the subject of houses along 82nd, one of the things I love about the Avenue of Roses is the fact that despite most of the stretch being converted exclusively to commercial space, many of these old homes still pop up from time to time, as previously mentioned, just as businesses now. The ones that still exist, again, mostly predate 1930. This White House, which looks like it may actually still be a private residence, that stands on 82nd north of Duke Street, was built way back in 1897. This leads me to believe this home originally had an Anderson Street address. And while there are some old homes that stand alone, there are several instances where 2 or 3 old homes, often built the same year, are still standing, sporting a variety of different businesses. The original homes vary in terms of how close or how far back they are from present-day 82nd, and thus don't really help verify or disprove the theory as to why 82nd is so narrow. After this 1950s era work that was done on Portland's portion of 82nd, Clackamas County approved work, widening it in 1955. The following year, 1956, saw plans go into place to extend 82nd Avenue further north of Killingsworth Street, heading towards the city's airport. This probably explains why, just before reaching Killingsworth now, 82nd splits in two, with one portion still ending there, while an east side offshoot continues north to the airport. It would only be a few more years later, come 1962, that a new freeway would be approved for construction, branching off of Interstate 5 and cutting through West Lynn into Oregon City. It was noted that in the process of going from Oregon City into Gladstone, the freeway would utilize a portion of 82nd Avenue before veering further east and traveling north roughly in line with 96th Avenue. This was the general route that would become Interstate 205, but its actual construction running through Portland would still be more than a decade away. It is said that I-205 only ran from Tualatin into Gladstone in the early 70s, but it also lists the Portland portion as the one that was built later. But there's about a 3.5 mile space between Portland and Gladstone, which left me wondering where 205 actually ended during the early 70s, and was 82nd Avenue involved, as they said it would be. With how things look now, I assumed they just ran 205 in close proximity to the 82nd Drive portion of the route, but they never really connected. But then I noticed in this 1960s map what clearly appears to be Interstate 205 running parallel to 82nd Drive, or, quote, 82nd Street Road as it's listed on the map. And this route ultimately ends in the region where 82nd and 205 meet today. I'm sure there's plenty of older locals who remember exactly how this all looked back then, but I'm having to make a few presumptions here, as there are a lot of this particular type of information that is either vague or muddled by some inconsistencies. This map also shows that a portion of 82nd still veered off and continued where 82nd Drive is today, something that would be drastically changed with the expansion of 205 into Portland and create the present-day circumstances of 82nd Avenue officially ending there at the freeway. One benefit of the creation of I-205, also running north and south, just a short distance away, was that it helped alleviate traffic on 82nd, which before then was packed with traffic, as you'd understand. Car accidents were an everyday occurrence. Cruisers, as they were called, started using the avenue to race up and down, a problem that persisted on into the 1980s. By the 1970s, the future avenue of Roses had truly undergone the transition into, well, what it's more or less stayed as for the past half a century. Traffic congestion, increased crime, an ever-growing presence of drugs and other forms of vice, and an overabundance of signage. The majority of 82nd had deteriorated to such a degree that nearby Salem, who was dealing with their own traffic issues, would often reference 82nd Avenue as the exact opposite of what they should aspire towards with their highways. And then came the 1980s, with all of its violence.
So this is one of the things I love in terms of actual legit abandoned places. Not this building. I mean, this is kind of cool. Just across the street from McDaniel High School, and there is, honest to goodness, and I mean, I don't know if it's really fully abandoned. If anything, the land just hasn't been used for anything in a long time. But right around this corner is an old driving range. Caught fire a few years back, but hasn't really changed the overall look to it. And this has been sitting here for quite a while. I did a video on it back in the day, and they may have security here, but I guarantee you there's at least a handful of people living in here somewhere in the brush. But yeah, you can see there's the cover. People would drive their balls out into the field. And then there is a big field just beyond that. It's just kind of there. If you venture down to the other edge of this fence line, you can see, here's the old sign. It says, well, actually it says miniature golf. I know you can't, jeez, I can't even see it. Yeah, it's in there. Miniature golf. Maybe there was a miniature golf course here as well, but as far as I can tell, it's primarily a driving range.
Many of the troubles of the 70s carried on into the 80s, and in some instances got worse. The drug problem exploded in Portland during this decade as well, and it hit 82nd along with many other places, and that problem's never really fully gone away. And as the blight grew and 82nd saw itself no longer the primary east side route for commuters to take, the city of Portland started annexing more land east of there, stretching dozens of blocks beyond the avenue. And, as mentioned earlier, there was a larger population of people of color in the vicinity of 82nd, as well as east of there. A good number of these people, not all, were displaced from the north end of town when that area started becoming gentrified in the 90s, pricing them out of their homes now that their neighborhoods were finally being fixed up. The east side, around 82nd and beyond, has long been regarded as neglected, the part of town that's often forgotten. Several stretches of streets out here remain unpaved to this day. I still recall listening to two men on the bus a few years ago who obviously worked for the city, having a good laugh as they mocked those living on the east side for expecting better treatment from the city, while validating the notion that the city's more affluent citizens deserve to be treated better than the others. I wanted to smack them both in the back of the head. Yeah, 82nd's been beaten and busted up for a long time, and there's lots of issues with the east side, but beyond that, like most other things, these problems persist because little effort has been made to help the area. Sure, people need to act if they want their lives to get better, but when you're in an area where people are struggling to pay for food and shelter and to take care of their loved ones, there's only so much they can do to force real change. And there's some wonderful people out there. Some of my closest friends live out there. I lived out there when I was born. My wife grew up out there. It's a major portion of what makes up the city, and just because it doesn't fit in so much with the flashy and trendy parts of town or the keep Portland weird narrative doesn't invalidate their lives. Sorry, I've just heard a lot of stereotypes and rhetoric from the mouths of simple-minded people about those on the east side, like everyone's the same out there. As though places like the Pearl are rocking to the tune of diversity and sympathy. When it comes to these rougher elements in regards to 82nd, there's its intersection with Flavel Street, a spot widely regarded as the central hub of its Felony Flats area, much in the same way that, say, 92nd and Foster is considered the hub of the Lentz area. And back in 2022, I hopped off a bus on 82nd and Fremont and immediately felt this essence of danger, the likes I hadn't felt recently along the avenue. I hustled out of there as quickly as I could, darting across 82nd where Milton Street crossed. I found out in a newspaper article about a week later that 82nd and Milton had recently been deemed the most dangerous intersection in town, with crime of all sorts happening nearby. This came at a time where I was unintentionally ending up in messed up areas without knowing how bad it really was. For me personally, 82nd is a bit of an anomaly, as I've encountered many a potential sketchy person, but have seldom ever been bothered by anyone. I mean, aside from the time I was robbed at gunpoint.
And no visit to 82nd Avenue is complete without visiting this little spot right here. This is where I got mugged back in 2017. This guy lurched across the street, jumped in front of me, lured me back here, showed me his gun, said he'd shoot me in the leg if I didn't comply with him, and we hung out right about here for a couple of minutes while he took my camera, because I was walking in this area with a semi-expensive camera drooped over my neck. Not to victim blame on myself, but not the smartest idea, and he needed money for drugs, and it's wild that there was businesses right here, and we were right here, and there's a bunch of cars going up and down 82nd. They saw this big tall guy lurking over me right here, and I'm kind of just, just be cool, whatever, we'll make this work. I remember this space being larger when I took off that way, and he made me stuff my phone down in my pants because he was nice enough that he didn't want to take he wanted to take my battery, and I was like, I can't take my battery out of my phone. It was just one of those goofy Android ones, and so he pulled a glove out of his pocket, made me stick my phone in the glove, stuffed it down my pants, and he sent me off waddling that way. And the last thing he said to me was, don't do anything stupid. And as I'm waddling, I was like, don't worry. So yeah, so he took my camera from here, and then he told me to come back and meet him so he could give me the thing. This guy that pulled a gun on me told me, come back here and meet me so I can give you like the thing to go to the pawn shop I'm gonna take your camera to, and then you can go get your camera back. And I was like, oh yeah, sure, I'll come back right here and meet up with you, Mr. Gunman. I already accepted my losses, and that was the first time I ever used a credit card, because I had to have a camera, and so I bought a replacement camera and a replacement lens, and I went about my business with a nice fresh debt of about $1,000. Fun times, but I did walk away with my life.
In a city where, in particular parts of the east side, beat-up roads are the norm rather than the exception, 82nd has been in rough condition for a long time. I remember when I got my license, back in 2004, and driving on 82nd, and sometimes it was like rolling down a busted roller coaster. Now a plan is in place by the city called Building a Better 82nd, that has gone into further effect since the city's Bureau of Transportation obtained ownership of the avenue from the state in the summer of 2022. The plan is for extensive work to be done along 82nd between now and 2027, which will include fixing up the avenue itself while trying to make it safer by addressing its most dangerous spots and making it safer for pedestrians. And especially if you're a bus rider like me, you're feeling the effects of this early construction. But beyond work being done on the avenue itself, this plan also includes an effort to invest in the community and improve infrastructure along the avenue. On the city government's website, it describes this portion of the project as follows. After making the most critical repairs, Portland Bureau of Transportation will identify and prioritize future investments for a better 82nd Avenue. Over the next 2 years, Portland Bureau of Transportation will conduct broad and inclusive community engagement and work directly with community-based organizations and agency partners to determine what the Bureau should focus on for improving 82nd long-term. I hope this isn't just a bunch of psychobabble. Reviving such a long stretch of road with so many problems stretching from one end to the other, this is not a cheap or easy fix, and improving the quality of life around the avenue is an even more demanding project. I'm just hoping, beyond the absolute fixes 82nd Avenue needs, that in the end this isn't just another beautification project. In the past, Portland has been great at slapping a coat of paint on something and acting like the deeper problem has been fixed. So, my concerns, unfortunately, are valid.
Welcome to utter chaos. This is what it looks like when 3 major routes come together all at once. 82nd Avenue is way off there. It ends by merging into the freeway over there. There's an off-ramp that comes up here to become 82nd Drive and continues on. There's Interstate 205. And then over here, this is Highway 224. So it wraps up, crosses over there, and continues off that way. It's just a lot going on in this area.
While 82nd Avenue as we know it today ends as it merges into I-205, that obviously wasn't always the case. It previously curved in a southeastern direction and continued on towards the town of Gladstone and ultimately Oregon City. This curve would ultimately be taken over by Highway 224, which crosses over 82nd, and once this highway crosses I-205, it now becomes 82nd Drive, the former part of 82nd Avenue going south of there. However, with construction in recent years extending Highway 224 out east to become the Sunrise Expressway, a new ramp was constructed along 82nd Avenue just before it ends at the freeway. If one exits off the avenue onto this ramp, it now becomes 82nd Drive, so to a degree, the avenue and the drive are connected once again. During the construction project that happened along this stretch of the avenue in Clackamas County during the 50s, it was noted that the desire was to ultimately have this highway merge into McLaughlin Boulevard, or Old Highway 99 East, as opposed to crossing the Clackamas River on its own. However, this clearly never came to fruition. 82nd Drive along this stretch runs parallel to I-205 to its east, and unlike most of 82nd Avenue today, once the drive intersects with a Jennifer Street and continues south, there's not a whole lot of hustle and bustle going on between there and Gladstone. This 1950s project also noted widening would be done on 82nd between Flavel to King and down to Lake Road in Clackamas County. Now today, Lake Road doesn't reach 82nd, but it once did intersect with the avenue where it ends today. And 82nd remains 4 lanes wide until it reaches I-205. However, for the most part, 82nd Drive is only 3 lanes wide, if you consider the constant middle turn lane as one of those lanes. This suggests that even before the freeway and Highway 224 forced a breakup of this once ongoing avenue, once 82nd reached this area and Lake Road, it shrunk from 2 lanes going north and south to just 1 lane going north and south.
Gladstone, USA. Down towards the, where more or less present day remains of 82nd Avenue still linger? I don't know, can inanimate objects linger? I guess, if you talk about it the right way. So in the process of researching this whole thing, I've actually managed to solve some fairly easy to answer questions, but questions I had as a child because I grew up around here. And there were certain questions I had in direct relation to what I'm talking about in this video, but being a kid, I would have the question and not really take a whole lot of time to think about it. And one of those questions was, isn't it convenient? Why does an 82nd Drive start relative close proximity right around where 82nd Avenue presently ends? And there's a pretty easy answer to that question. Another thing that bewildered me as a child is how 82nd Drive ends the way that it does. It ends very abruptly, and it has something to do with a bridge, which, interestingly enough, this is Portland Avenue. There used to be a bridge past that fence that the trolley would go over, but it was just falling apart. They eventually had to rip it into the river, but the trolley used to come down here. So there was a bridge over there, but 82nd Drive, our bridge in question, is just a little bit further east. Right ahead of us is 82nd Drive, more or less the last stretch of 82nd, wraps down from all that drama. Highway 224 coming in, 82nd Avenue as it is today coming through, I-205 obviously, and then 82nd kind of wraps along the more or less borders I-205 to the east side of it, and then it crosses over to get to this side. So currently it's on the west side of 205, but 205 is right on the other side of that Safeway and this motel over here. Second Drive, right next to the DMV where I did my driving test and all of that. And right here, this is where 82nd Drive, formerly 82nd Avenue, this is where it ends. It ends in this kind of goofy cul-de-sac here. You just get here and you turn and you go back the way you came. So, you know, another question I had is, why does this once fairly busy road right over here just suddenly end right here? Like, obviously, yes, the river's here. It can't continue unless, of course, it had a bridge to cross. So another question I had as a kid, which is why does 82nd Drive just end all of a sudden right here, had a reasonably simple answer, which is that once upon a time it didn't. It crossed this bridge right here. Wow, mystery solved. Yeah, through my research, looking up articles specifically about 82nd Avenue, I started stumbling onto articles that were talking about 82nd Avenue being in Oregon City. And I'm like, oh, well, that's got to be like a completely different 82nd Avenue. 82nd Avenue never went that far. Well, once upon a time, it crossed this bridge, and whereas this is Gladstone on this side of the river, this is Oregon City. So yes, 82nd Avenue absolutely did, once upon a time, go as far as Oregon City. It just crossed this bridge, and as I understand it, they stopped having traffic on this bridge once I-205 was completed, which makes sense because all that traffic you're hearing, that's I-205 dead ahead. Like, there's nowhere for 82nd Avenue to go now. It would literally have to plow right through the freeway. So once upon a time, this barely wide enough to be a two-lane stretch was where 82nd Avenue continued on. And I hadn't been in this particular spot much, but I wondered why, when you get to the end of this passenger bridge, why there's like little abandoned stretches like this. And right on the other side here, this road does come off of a side street, so traffic can get down here. I mean, there's houses right here, so traffic can get down to the bridge on this side. But I mean, more or less, it just seems kind of strange, aside from that, why there's this just kind of dead-end road that just kind of meanders this way. And well, once upon a time, this road wrapped this way because it crossed the bridge. So as of this recording, I have yet to find any I need to go through some old maps of Oregon City to try to find out exactly what 82nd did. If 82nd just kept going straight forward once upon a time and just through the freeway here, or if this is a continuation of 82nd Avenue and it just wrapped around, because there were businesses and homes and even I think like a hotel that burned down that were on 82nd Avenue, Oregon City. So this stretch of 82nd had to have traveled at least a little ways further into town for there to be all that stuff that once stood alongside of it. So either 82nd kind of wrapped this way and kind of did something like that and eventually ended, or it came out there and this is maybe like a side street and it just kept on kind of going through there. Of course, this is very enticing. This says City Park, just no parking and no booze. That's gotta be old. But yeah, you can tell this is like a long abandoned road. Probably was a little wider once upon a time, but slowly on each side, nature has begun taking over. I know railroad lines used to travel through here more frequently. There is a railroad bridge around here somewhere, but if you get down in this brush enough, you can even see the piers for an old bridge are still over there. But there's like remains, there's like rocky remains from a bridge that dated back to like, God, it was like the 1860s or something like that. And I'm assuming this road just ends. I mean, it's got nowhere to go because right around the corner here, the freeway crosses the river right there. So you've just got this like abandoned stretch of road that once upon a time, I assume, just branched off of the Oregon City portion of 82nd Avenue. It's my presumption.
While today, 82nd Drive is not listed as a part of Highway 213, when it was still a part of 82nd Avenue, it was. Today, 213 just joins with I-205 from where 82nd Avenue merges with it, up to the Park Place exit in Oregon City, where it starts again on its own. Despite this, it actually makes a lot of sense that 213 starts exactly where it does in Oregon City. You see, if you continue down this little road from where it begins on the south side of the old bridge where 82nd crossed, you will wrap around and actually become Highway 213 again. This little stretch, while mainly known as a portion of Washington Street today, also bears the name of Old 82nd Street Drive. All this considered, this present-day continuance of 213 resumes right where a once-upon-a-time 82nd Avenue ended.